The police officer paled when he saw the neighbor's notebook, his eyes widening as he traced the handwritten calculations detailing exactly how to cleanse the street of the children. But to understand the horror of that moment, one must rewind to the humid Tuesday in April when the moving truck arrived at the end of the cul-de-sac. Mark stood on his porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, watching the new neighbor, Arthur, unload his life. There were no boxes of family photos, no worn armchairs, no scuffed bicycles. Everything Arthur owned was sealed in industrial-grade plastic bins, labeled with a label maker in a font too small to read from the sidewalk. Arthur himself was a man of sharp angles and grayscale clothing, his skin the color of uncooked dough, seemingly allergic to the sun. The trouble did not start with noise or parties. It started with the silence and the scrubbing. 3 days after moving in, Arthur was on his knees in the middle of the public road at 6 o'clock a.m., scrubbing the asphalt with a stiff bristled brush and a bucket of solution that smelled faintly of hospital corridors and burning plastic. Mark watched from his window, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. It was eccentric, sure, but harmless, Mark told himself. He had 2 sons, Leo, 8, and Sam, 6, who treated the cul-de-sac like their personal kingdom. They drew with chalk, they raced scooters, they existed loudly. The first direct contact happened a week later. Mark came home from work to find Leo standing confused near the curb. The vibrant hopscotch grid the boys had drawn that morning was gone, replaced by a wet, dark patch of asphalt that reeked of bleach. But it was not just erased. Arthur was there, crouching. He held a piece of white Taylor's chalk. He was not drawing pictures. He was drawing small, precise X marks where the boy's feet had scuffed the grass near his property line. Mark felt the protective instinct surge. He walked over, forcing a neighborly smile that did not reach his eyes. "Hey there. I'm Mark, from the Blue House. Just wanted to..." Arthur did not look up. He finished drawing a perfect right angle around a patch of weeds. "Contamination vector," Arthur muttered. His voice was dry like paper rustling. "Excuse me?" Mark asked, stepping closer. Arthur stood up abruptly. He was taller than he looked, looming over Mark. He wore clear latex gloves. "Your biological units," Arthur said, pointing a gloved finger at Leo, who shrank back. "They shed skin cells, saliva, mucus. They disrupt the sterile barrier. They reach children playing," Mark said, his voice hardening. "This is a neighborhood, not a laboratory. You see, not just bleach the street because they played hopscotch." "Chaos requires containment," Arthur replied, finally looking Mark in the eye. There was nothing behind those gray irises. No anger, no annoyance. Just a flat, terrifying vacancy. It was the look a scientist might give a petri dish that had grown an unexpected mold. "I am merely establishing the perimeter." Mark had a choice then. He could have laughed it off, called the HOA, or told Arthur to stay away from his kids. But the coldness of that stare triggered a primal alarm. He chose to draw a line. "Stay away from my boys," Mark warned, stepping between Arthur and Leo. "If you have a problem, you come to me. Do not speak to them." Arthur tilted his head, calculating. Interaction is not the goal. Removal of the variable is the goal. He turned and walked back to his house, his movements stiff and precise. Mark stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, watching the man disappear into a house that looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum. He grabbed Leo's hand, gripping it a little too tight. "Let us go inside, bud." The descent into paranoia was not sudden. It was a slow, suffocating drip. Mark tried to maintain normalcy, but the atmosphere on the street had shifted. The air, once smelling of cut grass and barbecue smoke, now carried a permanent, metallic tang, like ozone and ammonia. Arthur did not stop. In fact, Mark's confrontation seemed to have accelerated a timeline only the neighbor understood. The X marks on the street multiplied. They appeared on the sidewalk, on the base of the street lamp, and terrifyingly, on the edge of Mark's own driveway. Objects began to vanish. A Nerf football left on the lawn overnight was gone by morning. Sam's bicycle helmet, left on the porch steps, disappeared. Mark knew where they went. He stood by his bedroom window at 2:00 a.m., watching the yellow house. The windows were covered with blackout shades, but the garage light spilled out from under the door. He could hear a low, rhythmic hissing sound coming from within, followed by the grinding of a heavy-duty trash compactor. Mark called the police on the 4th week. The dispatch sent a patrol car, a tired-looking officer named Miller who clearly thought Mark was the problem. "He's washing his driveway, sir," Officer Miller said, standing on Mark's porch, notebook in hand. "Being obsessive about cleanliness is not a crime." "He stole my son's helmet," Mark insisted, pointing at the pristine, empty trash cans at the end of Arthur's driveway. He's destroying their things. He calls them biological units. "The guy is dangerous." Miller sighed. "Did you see him take it?" "No, but then I see not do anything. Look, neighbor disputes are tough. Maybe buy him a fruit basket? Kill him with kindness." The officer left, leaving Mark feeling smaller and more isolated than ever. The law required proof, evidence, a crime. It did not account for the feeling of being hunted. The breaking point of Mark's sanity came 2 days later. He woke up to a sound outside, a wet, slapping noise. He rushed to the front door and threw it open. Arthur was on Mark's lawn. He was wearing a full painter's Tyvek suit and a respirator mask. He was spraying a thick, white foam onto the oak tree where the boys had built a swing. The foam hissed as it hit the bark. "What the hell are you doing?" Mark screamed, sprinting barefoot across the wet grass. Arthur did not flinch. He continued spraying. "Fungal infestation suspected. Respiratory hazard. Neutralizing." Mark grabbed the sprayer tank strapped to Arthur's back and yanked. Arthur spun around with surprising strength, shoving Mark backward. Mark slipped on the wet foam and fell hard, the chemical soaking into his pajama pants, burning his skin instantly. "Do not interfere with the sanitation protocol," Arthur said, his voice muffled by the mask. He looked down at Mark with that same dead, clinical observation. "You are spreading the pathogen." Mark scrambled back, his skin stinging, scrambling for his phone to record, to get proof. But by the time he got the camera app open, Arthur had simply turned off the sprayer, marched back to his property, and closed the door. When Mark looked at the footage later, his hands shaking, all he had was a blurry video of a white back retreating and his own heavy, panicked breathing. He showed it to his wife, Sarah. She looked at the chemical burns on his legs, angry red welts. "We have to move," she whispered, hugging herself. "Mark, he's not right. He's looking at us like we rebugs." "We see not just move," Mark snapped, the stress fracturing his voice. "We have a mortgage. We have lives. I'm not letting some freak push us out." But deep down, he knew the freak was winning. The boys were terrified to go outside. The house felt like a bunker. Mark spent his nights sitting in the dark living room, a baseball bat by his knee, watching the yellow house. He realized with a sinking horror that he was losing his mind. He was becoming the obsession he feared. And all the while, the chemical smell grew stronger, seeping through the cracks in the windows, tasting like copper and death. The heat wave struck on a Thursday, thick and oppressive, making the air feel solid. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Most families were indoors with the AC blasting. Mark had come home late from work, exhausted, his head pounding from the fumes that seemed to permanently hang over the cul-de-sac now. He walked into the kitchen. "Sarah? Boys?" "I'm here," Sarah called from the laundry room. "The boys are in the backyard." Mark froze. The backyard. They were going stir-crazy, Mark. "I told them to stay behind the fence." "That's fine." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Mark's exhaustion. He ran to the back sliding glass door. The backyard was empty. The swing hung motionless from the dying, chemical-burned oak tree. The gate, the one that led to the side yard connecting to the front, was unlatched. "Leo! Sam!" Mark screamed, tearing the door open. He sprinted to the front yard. The street was empty. The sun beat down on the bleached white asphalt. Then he saw it. The garage door of the yellow house was open a foot off the ground. Mark did not think. He did not call the police. He did not call Sarah. He ran. He crossed the property line, ignoring the no trespassing signs that had been staked into the ground like grave markers. He threw himself at the garage door, gripping the bottom and heaving it up. The screech of metal on metal was deafening. Sunlight flooded the garage. Mark expected to see a workshop. He expected to see tools, maybe the stolen toys. Instead, he saw a clean room. The garage had been lined, floor to ceiling, with heavy, transparent plastic sheeting. In the center, there was no car. There was a large, sealed containment tent, hooked up to canisters with hazard symbols Mark did not recognize. And inside the tent, sitting on two metal stools, were Leo and Sam. They were not tied up. They were not crying. They were sitting perfectly still, their eyes wide with terror, staring at Arthur. Arthur stood outside the plastic tent, holding a clipboard. He was not wearing the Tyvek suit this time. He was wearing a tuxedo. An immaculate, pressed black tuxedo. He looked like an undertaker prepared for a funeral. "Daddy!" Leo screamed, seeing Mark. Arthur turned slowly. He did not look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Processing is not complete," he said calmly. Mark lunged. "Get away from them." Arthur sidestepped with eerie grace and raised a remote control. "The enclosure is hermetically sealed," Arthur stated, his voice flat. "If you breach the plastic without decontamination, the integrity is lost. I will have to initiate the flush cycle immediately." Mark froze. He looked at the canisters hooked to the tent. Yellow gas lines ran from them into the intake valves of the plastic prison where his son sat. "What is that?" Mark choked out, his hands trembling. "What are you doing?" "They are the source," Arthur explained, as if teaching a slow child. He tapped the clipboard. "I tracked the vectors, the noise, the dirt, the chaotic movement patterns. It all radiates from these two coordinates. You refused to control the infestation. So I prepared a solution." Arthur's finger hovered over a red button on the remote. Chlorine gas mixed with a stabilizing agent. Painless. Quick. Total sterilization. The neighborhood will finally be quiet. Mark stared at the monster in the tuxedo. It was not hatred. It was not rage. It was hygiene. To Arthur, Leo and Sam were just bacteria on a countertop, and he was the Lysol. "Arthur," Mark said, his voice trembling, holding up his hands. "They read just kids. Please." "They are messy," Arthur corrected, "and mess spreads." Arthur's thumb pressed down on the button. The hiss was the loudest sound Mark had ever heard. Inside the tent, a yellow fog began to vent from the ceiling valves. Leo and Sam screamed, covering their mouths. Mark did not think about the gas. He did not think about the weapon. He saw a heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the door. He did not run for Arthur. He ran for the tent. Mark grabbed the extinguisher and swung it with every ounce of hysterical strength he possessed. The red cylinder smashed into the thick plastic sheeting. It did not break. The plastic stretched, rebounding. The gas was descending. The boys were coughing. "Futile," Arthur observed, watching the gas levels. "The polymer is reinforced." Mark turned. He looked at Arthur, the tuxedo, the clipboard, the absolute arrogant certainty of his order. Mark realized Arthur expected a fight. He expected Mark to attack him, to play the role of the chaotic aggressor. But Arthur was frail. He was a creature of distance, of chemicals and barriers. He feared contamination above all else. Mark did not attack. He grabbed a canister of the industrial cleaner sitting on the workbench, the one with the skull and crossbones, uncapped it and splashed the corrosive liquid all over himself. He drenched his shirt, his arms, his face. It burned like hellfire. He screamed, but he turned and sprinted, not at the tent, but at Arthur. Arthur's eyes went wide for the first time. Real fear. "Contamination!" he shrieked, backing away. "Do not touch! Do not touch!" Mark did not stop. He tackled Arthur, wrapping his chemical-soaked arms around the pristine tuxedo, pressing his burning, wet face against Arthur's neck. "Dirty!" Mark roared, smearing the fluid and his own blood and sweat onto the man. "I'm dirty. It's all over you." Arthur shrieked. A high, piercing sound of absolute psychological shatter. He dropped the remote. He clawed at his own face, at his clothes, convulsing in a seizure of phobic terror. "Get it off! Get it off! Unclean!" Mark scrambled off the writhing man, snatched the remote from the floor, and smashed the vent override. The hissing stopped. The fans reversed. The yellow fog began to suck out of the tent. Mark grabbed a wrench and smashed the lock on the tent zipper, ripping it open. He dragged Leo and Sam out, their lungs heaving, coughing, but alive. He shoved them toward the sunlight of the driveway. "Run. Go to Mrs. Gable's house. Run." Sirens wailed in the distance. Sarah had called them. Mark collapsed on the garage floor, his skin blistering from the chemicals, watching Arthur. The man had stripped off his tuxedo jacket and was clawing at his own skin with his fingernails, drawing blood, trying to peel off the imaginary contamination Mark had inflicted on him. He was sobbing, curled in a fetal ball, broken not by violence, but by a hug. When the police arrived, weapons drawn, they found Mark weeping in pain and relief, and Arthur catatonic, whispering "unclean" over and over. It was an hour later when the scene was secured. The paramedics were treating Mark S. Burns. That was when the older sergeant, a man with gray stubble, walked out of the garage holding a thick, black leather-bound notebook he had found on Arthur's drafting table. The sergeant looked at Mark, then at the house, and his face drained of all color. He looked like he was going to be sick. "Is he going away?" Mark asked, his voice a rasp. The sergeant walked over, opened the notebook, and showed Mark a page. It was not just a diary. It was a blueprint. There were maps of the entire cul-de-sac. Every house, every child. Beside each name were calculations, body weight, lung capacity, and the precise milliliter dosage of gas required to neutralize them. "He was not just doing your kids, Mark," the sergeant whispered, pointing to the date at the top of the page. "The Great Sanitation tonight." He had the ventilation systems of the whole block mapped out. He was going to pump the gas into the sewer lines tonight. He was going to wipe out the whole street while you slept. Mark looked at the notebook. He saw the neat, precise handwriting. The column titled "Projected Debris Removal." Arthur was taken away in a hazmat suit at his own screaming request. He was committed to a maximum security psychiat.